I'd like to welcome you to the Prioritizing the Common Core State Standards book study. Several educators have asked me what prompted me to write this new edition of my 2003 book, Power Standards. And what I've said to them was the fact that when the Common Core State Standards came out, they had been advertised as being fewer, clearer, and higher. And I knew that the prioritizing process had been so applicable to state standards for the past decade, owing to the fact that there were so many of those standards in every single state that I had visited. So my curiosity piqued when I wanted to find out how many standards there actually were in these Common Core State Standards, thinking that if there were truly fewer, then the need to prioritize those standards would no longer exist. And it was very interesting because after all these years, we used to literally count the numbers of standards in the different content areas and all the grades K-12 in the many states that I visited, and we usually found the numbers of those standards to be well up into the 70s, 80s, 90s, and even into the hundreds. And when you think about the learning challenges that students face to acquire this many standards and really be able to demonstrate proficiency of those standards, the numbers became daunting. And for that reason, the prioritizing process was always very well received, and it really did help educators see the power of going through those standards to identify those that they felt were truly the most essential for students to learn. State standards did need to be prioritized because of the voluminous number of them. And when you think about the need for teachers to teach those standards, assess their students on those standards, and then be able to reteach and reassess those same standards, it was clear that the necessity for prioritizing would be there. The Common Core State Standards, however, present a very new challenge for educators. And that challenge is the fact that they have been organized so that each grade level's standards become the prerequisites for the succeeding grade. So what that actually means is that teachers realize that these standards need to be mastered prior to students leaving that grade, and in order for them to be ready to enter the next grade. So what is the rationale for prioritizing the Common Core State Standards? First, it's really important to remember that these standards have been internationally benchmarked to high-performing countries around the world. And the fact that these standards are vertically spiraled from one grade to the next means that it's going to really be important for educators to focus deeply on individual standards that will help students achieve the goal of having all those standards, as I said earlier, mastered by the end of the grade level. Over the years, I've found that there is a persistent misconception that exists about prioritizing the standards, whether they be state standards or even the Common Core. And that perception is that it is a dumbing down or lowering to the minimum of what we expect our students to know and be able to do. Nothing could be further from the truth. So I would just encourage you to always be on guard for the misperception that prioritizing means eliminating certain standards in favor of others. Because of the way the Common Core have been built, the fabric of these standards is such that all of the standards are important, and they all factor in to making sure that students are truly ready for college and career by the end of their K-12 schooling experience. So the challenge for our educators is to really sharply focus instruction, assessment, and curriculum design on those standards that represent the end game, those standards that are the most rigorous and comprehensive, not the ones that are the most foundational. And so the way to identify these most rigorous standards is simply to have educators sit down together, read the standards, talk about the standards, think about the implications in terms of how they would prepare students to be successful at the next level of learning, and then identify those particular standards through this prioritization process that truly would enable students to have those assured competencies that they need to be successful at the next level of learning. So we're talking about the rationale for prioritizing the Common Core state standards. One of the things I would ask you to do now is to spend a few minutes looking through the book and examining the figures, the tables that I have included in the book, which show the numbers of English language arts and math standards. And then at that point, to really be asking yourself two critical questions. One of them, is there enough time, instructional time in any given school year for students to adequately receive instruction on each of these standards, be assessed on each of these standards, be retaught the standard if they are not yet proficient, and given the opportunity to be reassessed on that standard. And the other question to ask yourselves is, are all of these standards equal in terms of the degree of emphasis you would need to place on them instructionally? The next question I'd like you and your colleagues to explore is the actual definition of priority standard. What does that mean to you? And if a standard is not identified as a priority standard, then what would you call that standard? One of the definitions that I've used for priority standards is the fact that they are a subset of the total list of standards for each grade level. And those standards in that subset represent, as I mentioned earlier, the end game. The standards that are the most rigorous and the most comprehensive. And often it's been interesting because in the days of power standards, with state standards, we used to talk about identifying the standards that were considered the most foundational, the ones that teachers would often say, all kids need to know and be able to do this. But what's different about the Common Core and about the priority standards definition as related to the Common Core is the fact that we're not looking for the most foundational, we are looking for the most comprehensive, the most rigorous, the standard that would represent, as I've said a couple times now, the end game, where students would really need to be by the end of the year. Those are the priority standards. Those are the standards to emphasize the most through instruction and assessment throughout the school year. Those other standards that are not designated as priority standards are called supporting standards. These are the standards that support, connect to, or enhance the priorities. They are taught within the context of the priority standards, but they do not receive the same degree of instructional emphasis. Oftentimes, those supporting standards represent the ones that students will need to progress through in order to attain the more rigorous endgame priority standards. Teachers will use those supporting standards as instructional scaffolds to help the students get to that end destination. Once people agree that the priority standards do need to be identified, the next question that obviously comes to the fore is, well, how do we identify them? What are the criteria for identifying certain standards to be emphasized with some of the established criteria for prioritizing the Common Core? Those three in particular are endurance, those concepts and skills that will last over years and possibly an entire lifetime. Leverage, which simply means if students are able to demonstrate a skill in one area of the curricula, could they transfer or leverage that same skill in another area? And the third, and the one that is most often cited, not only with regard to state standards, but also with the Common Core, is readiness for the next level of learning. Which standards really do represent those prerequisites students will need in order to enter the next grade level prepared for success at that grade level? The other criterion that might have come up during your discussion is that of external tests. What do students need to be successful on the upcoming PARC and Smarter Balance assessments that are being created at present and implemented for the first time in the 2014-15 school year? These four criteria, endurance, leverage, readiness for the next level, and also the consideration of external exams, are the established criteria for identifying power standards and also priority standards with the Common Core.